Okay, so this morning I made a quick short video. If you want to watch it, you can. It explains, and hopefully all you people listening now have already watched it because it's very important. It just explains what this week is going to be like. First, let's just remember it's just this week. The hope is that this week or 2 virtual days next week give us kind of 2 weeks to do all the things that we're supposed to do, wash our hands, social distance, stay out of big groups, so that when we come back December 2nd or whatever that is, yeah, that we can come back regular. So that's the hope in getting through this. But for us, because we are AP, we cannot change the way that we do anything. So there'll be no repeating of lessons. Tomorrow, we're going to pick up right where we left off here today. So those kids that aren't listening at home, tomorrow they won't know where we're at. So you need to make sure you're listening to the lectures at home. If you haven't been listening, you need to make sure that you do, because on Thursday, our test will be, and yeah, and if you haven't listened, you'll be missing. So yes, our test is Thursday. So here's what we have to figure out. I think what's going to happen is you guys are Thursday, right? You'll be back on Thursday. So you guys will take your test Thursday, and then my Tuesday people will take theirs on Friday. So Tuesday people, you guys are Friday. Wednesday, we got a bunch of quizzes to take. I'm just going to throw them all on Wednesday. I think we should be able to finish up the better part of our lecture today. I haven't looked. I hope so. We have had a lot of questions, but if not, we can do that. Actually, we won't finish today. We'll finish Tuesday. So that's what we'll be looking at. Oh, yes, we're good. We're at the stuff I don't like anyway. Yep, we're good. We'll finish. So that's what we'll do. And here's just hoping we don't have to do this, but just, I like your mask. That's very pretty. That would have went with my outfit. Awesome today. Way better than my camouflage pink. So here's last year, just so that you guys have a general idea, because people that are not here, Ben asked about Zoom. Here's why I don't do Zoom. I have a lot of reasons why I don't do Zoom, but one reason I don't do Zoom is I was the oldest kid, and I kind of think about what would my life be like if I was at home. So if I was at home as I was as a sophomore in high school, I would have been responsible for a little sister, and I probably would have been responsible for making sure she did her stuff. Also, as a sophomore, not that you really need to know that, but that was the height of my parents' divorce. I mean, and when I say divorce, it was horrible. My mom threw my dad's record albums off the balcony. People wanted to walk home with me to see what my parents were going to do every day. And I can laugh about it now because it's funny. I know, Hannah, you feel bad for me. Don't feel bad for me. I'm good now. Thank you, Hannah. But I never knew what my parents were going to do. And so I try not to assume that everybody is at home with everybody around the kitchen table and everybody being nice and quiet while you're Zooming. So that's my personal feeling about Zoom, that it sets up something that some kids can't participate in. And so I just don't do it. If you want to talk to me, we can set up individuals. And I don't say that I don't Zoom, Ben, but what I did last year with AP is I just set one up twice a week at 7 o'clock. Whoever wanted to show up, showed up. Most of the time, we didn't even talk about AP. We talked about other stuff. So that's, fingers crossed, knock wood, every other kind of omen, that we don't ever have to do that the rest of this year. But if we do, I just sit at my table every night, and I do it at night so that you can watch the video whenever you want to, and I record the video. So I sit there at night, I record them, post them at night, and show them up, and then ask questions, that kind of stuff. Okay? That's how I feel about Zoom. And every teacher's different about it. But I think my experiences in high school making me think about what life can be like at home for other kids that don't have, just me being responsible for my little sister would be hard enough to make a Zoom meeting, because she would be right there with me. My middle sister was the most aggravating person that walked the face of the earth. She would make things aggravating, and then I would never know what my parents were going to do. And I guess like you could always hit mute, but that's really hard for me to, if my parents were doing the stuff, the crazy stuff that they did. Yeah, my mom really did throw my dad's record albums off the balcony, one at a time, saying every name of them and curse words. Like, here's your blankety blank Merle Haggard, and here's your blankety blank. Yeah. Yeah. Because they argued over who was going to get the record player. And yes. And so my mom got the record player, and my dad got the albums. That's how bad it was, just saying. So, all right. Anyway, the place where we're at in our notes, page 16, this part of the stuff is the part that I don't like. It's the society. It's all the stuff about when people got married and when they, so we're going to go through it pretty quickly. The only time these questions really come up is in either short answers or long essays. And in that aspect, the long essays you have a choice of. I would highly recommend not to pick these because they're not fun to answer. They tend to be a broad topic, but it is part, again, of the history and the way society is going to change to allow the French Revolution to happen, because that's where we're headed. We're headed toward the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. So life in the 18th century, which is the 1700s. Again, if that's not sticking in your head, make sure you write that somewhere. Nuclear family, most common in a nuclear family is mom, dad, children. I think we tend to always think about in this time period that there were lots of people all living in the same house. The problem is there's not, those houses aren't big enough for that. And so most of them are nuclear family. On average, the age of marriage was higher prior to the 750s. And again, that's an economic problem of starting a new home. Late 20s or older for both men and women. Couples could not marry until they could support themselves economically, and that becomes the problem and the issue. Peasant boys often had to wait until their father's death to gain their inheritance. And so we have this later dates of marriage, which I think is a little bit unusual that most people think. On page 17, the only thing I think that's really important to remember from this kind of section is on page 17, number 3. And we're going to meet that again when we get to the 1800s, especially in the Germanic states. Some areas required legal permission or approval of the local lord or landlords for marriage. So if you wanted to get married, you had to go up and knock on the door of the lord of the manor and say, can I marry this person? Am I allowed to marry this person? Yes.
I heard that like during slavery in America, you had to like ask the slave owner, and then they would like jump a broom.
Yes, yeah, it's the same, and it wasn't necessarily asking. It was in the United States during slavery. It was more or less the slave owner matching and marriage matching the enslaved people. It wasn't necessarily, they weren't always allowed to marry whom they wanted, but that's a different topic. This one is just the locals. Austria and Germany are going to have that into the 19th century, and that's going to be one of the catalysts for some very important revolts that are going to happen. Revolts and rebellions that will happen in Germany and in Austria, that people in Germany could not marry without asking someone. Local governments that believe without regulating marriages, lower classes would create more paupers, abandoned children. So they use this as a way to restrict as a population control device. And again, most people don't like it. And there will be a lot of people that don't ever get married. They live more like common law husband and wives, because this idea of marriage becomes an economic difficulty. Children, the rate of births out of wedlock is fairly low. Again, I think always have the assumption that that's kind of high. But again, it's the idea of people being pressured into marrying when they get pregnant out of wedlock. Premarital sex was generally limited to couples who were already thinking about marriage. And number of children per family is fairly big. If husband and wife live to age 50, odds of about 50% of their kids will die before they're 6. Infant mortality is really high. Infant mortality is the percentage of kids that live past the age of 5. And so it's 20% in good areas, 33% in poor areas. The infant mortality rate, and sadly, the United States of America has a high infant mortality rate compared with other Western nations. But like in Japan, it's less than 1%. Less than 1% of all. Yes, ours is high. Ours is about 15 to 20%. It's horrible. It's horrible that in a Western wealthy nation that our infant mortality rate is that high. And it's all because of access to healthcare. If your parents don't have insurance, you're not going to the doctor. So it's very sad. It's a sad, sad statistic that the wealthiest, best healthcare system in the world has one of the highest westernized infant mortality rates. It's sad. 50% to survive into adulthood was good. Patterns of marriage, again, the growth of cottage industry, increased income resulted in higher rates of people marrying for love. That's the only thing that you need to know on that page, and that the only thing we're really going to talk about is our marriage moves from economic to love. Instead of having to find someone to support you, you could actually marry for love. And then on page 18, because of that, we have an explosion of birth by illegitimacy from 1750 to 1850. It is going to be really high, and mobility is going to do that. In Germany, illegitimate births were a result of open rebellion against class laws, and we'll talk about that as well. Young women had limited economic independence, and so again, that's going to change as we go through. Attitudes toward children. This is another common long essay topic on the bottom of page 18. Child care and nursing. So one of the things when we look at children in European history, and it shows itself in the paintings of children especially, that those kids are dressed like little adults. So imagine in your head a family picture of when you were a kid, wherever it may be, a Christmas picture or something you took with church where you were under the age of 5. Everybody got that picture in their head? Now put the outfit that your parent is wearing on you and think how weird that is. But then look at the baby on the cover of our book, and the baby is wearing what his mother, because that baby's a boy, first of all, in case you did not know, it's a boy. He's wearing what his mom's wearing. So that's the difference, that kids were not treated as children. One, because there was a 50% chance they were going to die. Let's not get too attached to this thing. And 2, children had the expectation of being little adults. And so when we look back, especially at that chapter where we were in the scientific revolution, and then in our next chapter when we get to the Enlightenment, we're going to read about kids as young as 4 and 5 that could speak like 3 and 4 languages. Like, what? Like, how is that possible? And it's possible because they weren't treated like children. They weren't nurtured. They weren't allowed to play. They didn't have the same type of upbringing. And so this is what we're changing with these attitudes. Poorer women generally breastfed their infants for much longer periods in the 20th century. So what happens to that idea of breastfeeding or nursing becomes a socioeconomic status. Rich women didn't do it. Why? Because poor women did. And that idea of nursing or breastfeeding held on until probably the 1980s or 90s, that was something poor people did. And it really wasn't until, again, the late 80s, early 90s, that this revision became of the idea that it's much better for your children to do that. Infants more likely to survive on mother's milk than artificial food. So even though those poor kids were poor, their mothers were doing what was in the best interest. Women of the aristocracy and upper middle class seldom to never breastfed. That would be what they would do under be a wet nurse. So a wet nurse would be someone that they would hire to nurse their children. If you were a woman, the best job to have was to be a wet nurse. The best job, because that's all you did. You didn't have to clean, you didn't have to cook, you did no chores. All you did was care and nurse this baby. And that was the best job to have. And if you were good at it, you could continue to do that. And Ben, we're not going to get too far down the road on this, but as a wet nurse, as long as you keep nursing, you keep making breast milk. It's kind of like a cow. As long as you keep milking the cow's going to make milk. Okay? It's the best job to have. Many babies were sent to the countryside. Wet nurses took 2 to 3 years. So you could be a wet nurse for 2 to 3 years. And again, that's important. Now, that's the positive side. The negative side is going to show up on page 19, infanticide. Infanticide is killing your baby. At the top of page 19, medieval church denounced it, right? It's not right to kill babies, but that's going to happen, yes.
So infanticide just means
killing your baby. Mm-hmm. Yep. And it is rampant. Sometimes an intentional overlaying occurred in many cases where parents just roll over and suffocate a child in bed. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. Foundling hospitals, and a foundling hospital is an orphanage. So foundling hospitals are going to open first in Paris. That's going to be the very first place that orphanages will occur. Poor women will leave their babies on the doorstep of churches. A third of all babies born in Paris were immediately abandoned in these foundling homes. A third of them come from married couples. So please don't make the mistake that all of these are illegitimate births. Some are families that cannot afford another mouth to feed. And so if we look at this in a very heartless, academic way, if I have 4 children and I have a baby that's born and I got to feed 4 children and a baby, it's much harder to look at my older 4 children and say there's no food as opposed to the baby. And so that becomes the overlaying, the smothering at night, or what often happens is drowning in the rivers. So in Paris, it will be in the River Seine where babies will be dropped, and in London, it will be in the Thames River. And it, again, is horrible, but again, it is the choices that mothers had to make and had continued to make. Foundling hospitals in St. Petersburg cared for about 25,000 babies, receiving 5,000 new babies every single year. Half of all the babies are going to die at a year. Almost 90% of those are going to die. And one of the reasons will be neglect in a way of nurturing. So my mother-in-law, as a nurse, and most of you probably know this, as nurses, you have to go around and do clinicals at all different types of hospitals and institutions. So you get a wide variety of experiences in the nursing world, just like doctors do. And she did a clinical at a she did a clinical in a orphanage. And so you want to come back at the end? Okay. All right, thanks. And she said, and she had already been, she ended up being an OBGYN nurse practitioner, labor and delivery nurse her whole. And so she had just come from labor and delivery in a nursery. And she said she was so looking forward to this orphanage and helping babies. And she said when she walked in, it was quiet, like the quietest place she's ever been. She said there was like 40 babies, no noise. And she asked because she did hers with a Catholic church, she asked the Mother Superior, like, why aren't these babies crying? And this is the saddest thing. It's just, she says the Mother Superior said they stop crying because they know their needs won't be met by crying. That's why babies cry, right? Babies cry because they're hungry, they're wet, they need you to be picked up. And so when they don't get that, it stunts. And so that, again, 90% of them dying doesn't necessarily mean they wanted for anything. It's just that they were neglected because they couldn't pick up and hold 5,000 babies. all the time. And it is, again, part of this time period that makes it horrible. Child rearing. Children were treated indifferently and with strict physical discipline. High mortality rate. Most children in aristocratic, noble households were typically sent away from home when they're 7. They're sent away to boarding school. So you think back when you were 7, and how many times, I think I use this all the time, you attempted to spend the night with a friend and got, oh, Mom, my stomach hurts. Can you come pick me up? 7, they are sent away to boarding school. And at that age, I'll get your questions again. At that age of 7, you're with like 13, 14-year-old peers who are not always nice. Yes.
So we're still doing that once you reach 7, you can be sent off anywhere. Like, I know in world history you talk about like how the Roman.
Who? Oh yeah, Prince
Romans,
Harry,
like,
Prince
7.
Harry, and Prince William were sent to boarding school at the age of 7.
Wasn't it the Romans that sent them off at
That's
7?
Sparta.
Sparta.
Mhm. Yep.
And did fight.
Yep. There still are. There's this very big disconnect, especially with royal, aristocratic, not getting too attached to your children. Doctors often decline to care for sick children. Like, there's no reason to even tend to them because they're going to get sick and die. Spare the rod, spoil the child, again. And the typical thing is that rule of thumb. A rule of thumb meant that a man could beat his wife and or child with anything that's not thicker than their thumb. That was where that, have you ever heard that thing, a rule of thumb? It's a very common phrase. That's what it means. My husband is Polish, half Polish. His hands are like cinder blocks. His thumb is like the size of a skinny person's leg. He's got just these, yeah. So I don't know that I would have survived that. Bottom of page 19, humanitarianism and Enlightenment optimism regarded human progress emphasized the better treatment of children. So eventually we're going to get that. Next chapter, we're going to change that idea of how we rear children. I'm not going to go into Rousseau and all that because we're going to get that all in our next chapter. Work away from home. Many young people worked within their families until they could start their own household. Boys plowed and wove. Girls spun thread, tended to animals. Increasingly, many boys worked away from home, and they will be admitted to a trade or a guild and not allowed to marry. A large number of girls are going to start working away from home. Most of them will be in domestic service. Look at 3E. Servant girls had very little independence. They were very vulnerable to physical mistreatment of their mistresses, and they often become sexual victims. Upper class commonly exploited servants sexually. If a girl became pregnant, she was quickly fired, and so that leaves prostitution and petty thievery as their only alternatives. And that petty thievery usually is pickpockets. So these girls would get themselves dressed in the best types of clothing they could afford, and then they would intermingle on the streets with upper class, picking their pockets and taking watches and jewelry and whatever they could. There were often girls who would, especially in large homes in London that had a large staffing, like 100 servants. They would often dress as servants, kind of slip into houses, steal things, and then slip back out. That was another way that they could earn a living. But it was not easy to be a young girl poor in these large cities like London and Paris. Education. So we haven't really talked about education. Education in Europe, unless you're in the Germanic states or is really for poor people, will be limited to none, unless you were lucky and had a mother that somehow picked up a little bit of reading and taught you to read so that you could read the Bible. The whole purpose, again, of that Protestant Reformation was to teach the reading of the Bible. So on page 20, the beginnings of formal education for the masses took root, largely inspired by Protestantism, right? Protestantism is going to be that thing that says people should read the Bible, know the sacred text themselves. Little schools of elementary education began to appear in the 17th century. Boys and girls from 7 to 12 were instructed in basic literacy and religion. So these little schools were again tied to religion, teaching some kind of morals, some kind of religious stories and Aesop's fables kind of thing. The Church of England and the dissenting groups such as the Protestant or the Puritans founded charity schools to instruct poor children. Scotland's going to have a whole lot of schools. France is going to establish Christian schools which taught religion. And starting in 1717, Prussia, on page 21 of everything I've said up to this point, the only most important thing is on page 21, and I would put a big box around this. Prussia is going to start with universal compulsory education. So universal means everyone. That's important because that's boys and girls. Compulsory means you have to. So in 1717, Prussia says everybody has to go to school. It's inspired by old Protestant idea that every Christian should be able to read the Bible, but 3B is what we're looking at. Education is seen as a way to make the population serve the state. So when we get to 1929, 1930, and this will be the rise of fascism and Nazis and Hitler, and we're all like, why did these people do this? Why didn't they say something? Because in 1717, Prussia, later Germany, begins using education as indoctrination. Don't question the state. And that, my friends, is how you begin to create a pattern that establishes a population that does not question their government, which we spend a lot of time in APUSH talking. One of the most patriotic things you can do is question your government. That's what makes us a democracy. Not questioning your government is what happens to places like Germany that fall in line because they are taught since 1717 to effectively serve their state. Enlightenment commitment to greater knowledge, again, will change that. But it is important to know literacy. Literacy is the ability to read at a 5th grade level, right? 90% of Scotland could read, male population. 2 out of 3 males in France. In Normandy, 90%. Only 50% of Brits, but it's still women increasingly literate, but lagged again behind men. On page 21, life expectancy is going to increase to 35 years. And the reason, again, that it's 35 is we have 2 groups of people. We have wealthy people that are going to live easily into their 60s and 70s, and then we have poor people that are going to die really early, and that becomes the average. Largely credit to the disappearance of the plague, more time spent in childhood on education, development of public health, improved sanitation, max vaccinations, better clothing, improvements in dry housing, and adequate food. Of that list, adequate food is a direct reflection of the agricultural revolution. Diet and nutrition, again, will be most important. The diet of ordinary people improved. We're getting vitamins, even though we don't know it, grains, vegetables, potatoes, important grains will be eaten. On the top of page 22, greater variety of vegetables existed in towns and in cities. And then page 22, medical improvements. The bubonic plague had disappeared. That'll be one of the biggest ones. And then 4B, smallpox. And this is Edward Jenner, and this is the beginning of vaccines. The conquest of smallpox was the greatest medical triumph of the 18th century. Smallpox is in the same realm as chickenpox. It's really the same thing, except with the little chickenpox, you get little teeny ones. A smallpox, you get giant ones. And what Mr. Jenner did was he injected you with a live virus, and you got a small case of smallpox, and then that made you immune. So This would be your grandparents, I'm sure. Your grandparents probably were inoculated from smallpox. Your parents are probably too young to be inoculated with smallpox. But smallpox, if they have, people will have this big, round, pitted scar on their forearm. That means they've been inoculated with smallpox. My generation, probably anybody older than 50, I think now it's probably about 52, has been inoculated with smallpox. It is a disease that we have eradicated from the face of the earth. Smallpox exists only in the CDC in Atlanta, and Russia has some. If it ever gets put out between the world again, I will live, you will die. I will live, I will survive. But again, it's a really important medical advancement, and the idea of telling someone, especially people who've watched people die of smallpox, entire towns, villages, families will be wiped out, that I'm going to give you the virus in this needle when I'm injecting under your skin, you're going to get smallpox. It was definitely an important step. This inoculation isn't going to happen as much in Europe as it is in the United States. In the United States, Sam Adams going to inoculate his family. United States will take off with Edward Jenner's inoculation of smallpox, and we'll leave that there. And on page 23, we'll just end up, and we'll get page 23 tomorrow. Religion, Wesley, that stuff. All right? Okay. All right, people, bye. We're stopping for the day. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see the B team tomorrow. So make sure you guys listen to this. Bye.